I've spent most of my life in the woods. I'm what you might call a seasoned ranger. Daniel Boone National Forest has been my home for the past 10 years. It's a beautiful place, sprawling with ancient trees and winding rivers. Peaceful, serene, and sometimes unnerving. If you've ever been in a forest at night, you know what I mean. There's a silence that feels too heavy, too unnatural. I've always believed that nature has a way of reminding us that we're not really in charge, no matter how much we think we are. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that summer evening in 1987. It's been decades, and I still don't have an explanation. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained. It started as an ordinary day. The sun was out. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. I was out on the Kentucky River, paddling my old canoe. It was my way of unwinding after a long week of patrolling trails and dealing with reckless campers. The river was calm, reflecting the deep green canopy above. I let the current carry me, dipping my paddle into the water every so often to steer. By late afternoon, I decided to head back upstream. The shadows were getting longer and I didn't want to be out after dark. But as I paddled, I noticed something odd. There were strange marks on the trees along the riverbank. Long, deep scratches, as if something with claws had raked through the bark. At first, I thought it might be a bear. But the spacing of the marks, they were too far apart, too deliberate. My gut told me something was off. I've seen plenty of animal tracks and signs in my time, but this was different. I shook it off and kept paddling. The river was unusually quiet now. The usual buzz of insects and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface had faded. An eerie stillness settled over the water, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw it. An abandoned campsite on the riverbank. The tent was torn to shreds, its fabric hanging in tatters from the poles. A fire pit was scattered, the ashes cold. I pulled my canoe to the shore and stepped out, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The first thing I noticed was the blood. It was splattered across the ground, smeared on the rocks near the water. My stomach churned as I found a shirt soaked in blood clinging to a low branch like some macabre flag. The air was heavy with the metallic scent, and I felt my heart begin to race. I called out, half hoping someone would answer. "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. But there was no reply, only the whisper of leaves in the faint breeze. I should have left then and there. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the canoe and paddle as fast as I could. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, kept me rooted. I pulled out my flashlight and decided to look around. As dusk fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the temperature dropped sharply. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a wheeze. It came from deeper in the woods, just beyond the campsite. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound came again, closer this time. My flashlight beam wavered as my hands began to shake. I swung it toward the source of the noise, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A massive shadow, hunched and unnatural, moving between the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. Silence. And then the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. Whatever it was coming closer. I backed toward the river, my flashlight darting wildly. That's when I saw it. Standing on the opposite bank, silhouetted against the fading light, was a figure. At first I thought it was a man, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else entirely. Its frame was impossibly tall and emaciated, like a skeleton wrapped in stretched, leathery skin. Its eyes were hollow, deep-set, and glowing faintly in the dim light. Antlers sprouted from its skull, twisted and jagged, as if nature itself had gone wrong. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped toward the edge of the river. Its gaze locked onto me, and I felt an icy dread wash over me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. Darkness swallowed me, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then came the screeches sound so piercing and unnatural it made my ears ring. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mix of agony and rage that seemed to shake the very ground. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the canoe. My hands fumbled with the paddle as I pushed off from the shore, the water sloshing around me. I paddled with everything I had, the muscles in my arms burning. But the thing on the riverbank didn't stay there. It followed me, gliding effortlessly along the shoreline, its glowing eyes never leaving me. Then the canoe tipped. One moment I was paddling, and the next I was underwater. The river was freezing, its current pulling me down. I fought to surface, gasping for air, but something grabbed me. Sharp, claw-like fingers dug into my leg, dragging me deeper. I thrashed and kicked, the cold searing my lungs as I struggled to break free. Somehow, I managed to claw my way to the surface and grab hold of a fallen branch. I pulled myself onto it, coughing and shivering, my vision blurred. When I looked back toward the riverbank, the figure was gone, but the air still felt heavy, charged with a sense of wrongness. I don't remember how I made it back to the station that night. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary, my body bruised and battered. My colleagues found me downstream, half submerged and barely conscious. They said I was mumbling incoherently about shadows and claws. They wrote it off as an accident, maybe a bear attack or a bad fall. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way those eyes pierced through the darkness, the sound of that screech echoing in my mind. To this day, I can't bring myself to go back to the Kentucky River. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't done with me. Every now and then I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those hollow eyes burning in my mind. Some things are better left unexplored, and some places are better left alone. In 1953, Big Bend National Park in Texas was a quiet, sprawling expanse of desert and mountain terrain. I had just started my shift as a park rangera job that gave me purpose after the chaos of the Korean War. My name is Jack Albright, and I'd served as an infantryman. I thought nothing in the States could ever unnerve me the way the war had, but I was wrong. It was a cloudless afternoon when my story begins. The desert stretched out endlessly before me, a rugged beauty of rocky outcrops and dusty trails. I was tasked with checking on hikers, ensuring they didn't stray too far or get caught in the unrelenting sun. It was routine work, the kind I usually found comforting. I was about an hour into my patrol when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints massive, far larger than any humans pressed deep into the sand. They were spaced oddly far apart, as if whoever or whatever made them had a tremendous stride. At first, I thought they might belong to a bear, but bears weren't common in Big Bend. The tracks seemed too deliberate, too symmetrical for any animal I could think of. The air felt heavier as I followed the trail. The rustling of desert grasses and the occasional chirp of a bird had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling. I'd seen enough in the war to know how the mind could play tricks on a person. A mile or so later, I came across a campsite, or what was left of one. A tent lay collapsed, its canvas shredded as if by claws. Scattered belongings, a backpack, a pair of boots, and a flashlight littered the area. The flashlight was cracked, its bulb shattered. A blood-soaked shirt hung from a low branch, fluttering slightly in the faint breeze. My heart pounded as I called out, "Hello, anyone here?" No response. The tracks continued beyond the campsite, heading toward a rocky ridge. I hesitated. Protocol dictated I should report this and wait for backup, but something compelled me to press on. Maybe it was the sense of duty drilled into me as a soldier, or maybe I just didn't want to believe I couldn't handle this on my own. As I climbed the ridge, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the desert in hues of orange and red. The shadows lengthened, and with them came an oppressive silence. I reached the top and scanned the landscape. That's when I saw it. A figure, hunched and massive, stood in the distance. It was too far away to make out details, but its silhouette was unmistakably human-like, yet grotesquely wrong. Its limbs were long and gangly, and it moved with a lurching, unnatural gait. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. My rational mind told me it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the rocks. But deep down, I knew better. I descended the ridge cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had to know what was going on. Night fell quickly in the desert. The stars were brilliant, but their light was cold and distant. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The tracks were still there, leading me deeper into the wilderness. That's when I heard the whispers. They were faint at first, carried on the wind. Guttural and low, they didn't sound like any language I knew. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, shining my light in every direction, but there was nothing, just endless desert. The whispers grew louder as I walked. My breathing quickened and my grip on the flashlight tightened. I called out again, my voice shaking, "Who's there?" No answer. Suddenly, the beam of my flashlight caught movement. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I could think of, and they didn't blink. My chest tightened as the figure emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, its skin leathery and taut over protruding bones. Its face was eerily human but distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face out of melted wax. Its mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The creature took a step forward, then another, its movements deliberate and predatory. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run. I stumbled over rocks and cacti, the creature's guttural whispers chasing me. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, mocking me. My training kicked in, and I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. I found a narrow crevice between two large rocks and squeezed inside, hoping it wouldn't be able to follow. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. Then, a shadow fell over the entrance to the crevice. I froze as the creature's hand-long and clawed reached inside, groping for me. I pressed myself against the rock, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear. The hand withdrew, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then the creature let out a low, rumbling growl that shook the very ground. It began to claw at the rocks, trying to widen the crevice. Desperation took over, and I scrambled out the other side, sprinting down the trail. I reached for my radio, but it was gone. I must have dropped it during my frantic escape. Without it, I had no way to call for help. I ran until my legs burned, until I could no longer hear the creature's whispers or growls. When I finally stopped, I realized I had no idea where I was. The desert was an endless maze of rocks and shadows. Exhausted, I found a small outcropping and climbed onto it, hoping the height would give me some advantage. I stayed there until dawn, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The creature didn't appear again, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. When the sun rose, I made my way back to the ranger station. My colleagues found me hours later, disheveled and incoherent. I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to exhaustion and dehydration. The campsite I found was reported as an abandoned site, and the missing hiker's case was eventually closed without answers. As for me, I left Big Bend shortly after. The desert's beauty had turned into something malevolent, and I couldn't bear to stay. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there. Locals speak of the Hollow Man, a creature that roams the canyons, but it's always dismissed as legend. Still, whenever I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes staring back at me, and I wonder if the desert ever truly lets anyone leave. I never thought much about fear. Being a park ranger in the Chippewa National Forest, I had come to terms with the dangers of the wilderness. Bears, wolves, hypothermia, they were all part of the job. But nothing prepared me for what happened that winter in 1968. It started as an ordinary day. The snow had come down heavy the night before, blanketing the forest in white. I loved mornings like this. Everything felt so clean, so untouched. The air was crisp, my breath puffing out in small clouds as I followed the faint tracks of a deer through the trees. My job that day was routine: check on the wildlife, monitor the state of the trails, and ensure no poachers had been sneaking around. The forest was quiet, too quiet maybe. I didn't notice it at first, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I realized how still everything was. No chirping birds, no rustling squirrels, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots. I told myself it was normal. Animals hunker down in the cold, but a small knot of unease began to form in my chest. Still, I pushed on. Around midday, I stumbled across something unusual, a small hunting cabin that I hadn't seen before. That wasn't odd in itself. There were plenty of old, abandoned cabins scattered throughout the forest. What caught my attention was the door. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the still air. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The cabin was dark, lit only by the weak sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. It smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. The first thing I noticed was the rifle, lying discarded in the corner. That struck me as strange. No hunter would leave their weapon behind, especially not in this weather. Then I saw the blood. Dark stains smeared across the wooden floor, leading toward the door. My stomach turned. I bent down, examining the trail. It looked like something had been dragged out of the cabin. But the strangest thing? There were no tracks in the snow outside. Nothing to suggest where the blood had come from or where it had gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty snow. My breath quickened. The knot of unease tightened into something sharper, something wrong. I decided to head back. The sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. I'd report the cabin and the blood to the sheriff in town. Maybe it was just an injured animal or an old hunter who'd hurt himself and made his way back without his gear. That's what I told myself anyway. The walk back was slow. The snow had grown deeper, and the temperature was dropping fast. My radio crackled faintly, static and bits of distant voices breaking through. I tried calling in, but the signal was too weak. Typical out here. Then I heard it. A low, hoarse breathing. It was faint at first, almost blending with the sound of my footsteps. I stopped, holding my breath, and the sound stopped too. I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. Nothing. Just shadows stretching long and dark against the snow. I started walking again, faster now. The breathing returned, louder this time. It wasn't my imagination. Something was following me. I gripped the strap of my rifle, ready to swing it off my shoulder at a moment's notice. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound firm. "Is someone there?" No response. Just that breathing, growing closer. I broke into a run, the snow dragging at my boots. My lungs burned, every breath sharp and cold. The trees blurred around me. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it, though a presence behind me, closing the distance with every step. Then I saw it. A figure stepped out from the trees, blocking my path. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't human. Tall and gaunt, its skeletal frame barely covered in thin, stretched skin. Its eyes glowed a pale, icy blue, like frost on a window pane. The Wendigo. I froze, my mind screaming at me to move, to run, to do something. But my body refused to obey. The creature tilted its head, studying. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The breathing grew louder, harsher, like the rasp of dry leaves against stone. I don't know what snapped me out of my trance. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe sheer terror. I fumbled for the flare gun at my belt, my fingers numb and clumsy in the cold. The Wendigo lunged, its long claws slicing through the air. I barely managed to raise the flare gun and fire. The flare burst into light, a fiery red that illuminated the trees. The creature recoiled, its shriek piercing and inhuman. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. The forest was a blur, the trees a maze I navigated blindly. I could still hear it behind me, crashing through the snow, but the sound grew fainter as I ran. When I finally stumbled into the ranger station, I was half frozen, gasping for air. My colleagues stared at me, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. All I could say was that something was out there. The next morning, a search party went out. They found the cabin, the bloodstains, the abandoned rifle. But there were no tracks, no sign of any creature, just the eerie, empty wood. I left the job not long after that, moved to a small town, far from the forest. But even now, decades later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. And every so often, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that hoarse, rasping breath. The Ozarks were supposed to be my escape. After 2 tours in Vietnam, I craved nothing more than silence the kind that only the deep woods could offer. When I took the ranger position at Ozark National Forest in the spring of 1974, I felt like I'd finally found my place. The forest, with its rolling hills and thick, misty underbrush, was alive but peaceful. It didn't judge me. It didn't remind me of what I'd done or seen. It just let me be. My days were simple: morning patrols, trail maintenance, and the occasional visitor who got lost or too ambitious. Evenings were for myself, spent at the small cabin the ranger station provided. No phone, no TV, just me and the sounds of the forest crickets, owls, and the occasional rustle of something larger in the undergrowth. That day started like any other. The sun filtered through the trees as I walked my usual route, checking for downed branches and signs of poachers. Birds chirped, and the soft rush of a nearby stream filled the gaps in the soundscape. I remember thinking how perfect it all was. Even the air felt cleaner here, untainted. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I returned to the cabin. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. I made a quick dinner, canned beans and some bread, and settled on the porch with a cup of coffee. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. The growl came again, this time followed by a howl long and mournful. It sounded distant, maybe a mile off, and I told myself it was just a coyote. They're not uncommon in these parts, especially at dusk. But something about it unsettled me. The pitch was too deep, too wrong. Shaking it off, I went inside and locked the door. Habit, mostly. I'd never felt unsafe out here before. That night, I slept fitfully. Dreams of the jungle, of being hunted, mingled with the sound of that growl. When I woke, the forest was unnaturally quiet. My patrol the next morning took me to a section of the forest I'd only visited a handful of times. It was more remote, harder to navigate. The mist hung heavy, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. About an hour in, I found the first one. A deer, or what was left of it. Its body was torn open. ribs jutting out like jagged teeth. The ground around it was soaked with blood, and tufts of fur were scattered like leaves. But it wasn't the gore that got me. It was the look in its eyes. Even in death, they seemed wide with terror. As I continued, I found more. 2 rabbits, a raccoon, and another deer, all mutilated in the same way. Some were still alive, but barely, their breaths ragged and shallow. I put them out of their misery, my hands shaking with each shot. Something was wrong. This wasn't the work of a coyote or even a bear. The bites were too large, the wounds too savage. It felt deliberate, almost cruel. I radioed the station to report the findings, but reception was spotty out here. All I managed to get through was a garbled message about animal attacks before the static swallowed my words. Frustrated, I decided to head back to the cabin. Whatever was out here, I'd deal with it better in the daylight. That night, the growl returned, closer this time. It echoed through the trees, low and menacing. Then came the howl, piercing and drawn out. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness. The forest seemed alive, every shadow shifting, every sound amplified. The growl came again, and this time I caught a glimpse of movementa large, hulking shape slipping between the trees. I faced danger before. Men with guns, traps, the chaos of war. But this was different. It was primal, a fear that gripped me deep in my chest and refused to let go. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It felt like it was watching me, studying me. The next few days were a blur of tension and sleepless nights. I set up traps, hoping to catch whatever was killing the animals. I even ventured deeper into the forest, against my better judgment, looking for signs. That's when I found the tracks. Massive, clawed prints that sank deep into the soil. They looked canine, but were far too large, each one nearly the size of my head. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't normal. The final night, the growls turned into something elsey, deep, guttural snarling that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin. It was here. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside, the cold night air biting my skin. The forest was deathly silent, as if every creature knew to stay hidden. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a pair of glowing yellow eyes piercing through the darkness. As it stepped into the moonlight, I felt my breath catch. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in shaggy fur that matted with blood. Its face was twisted, part wolf, part nightmare. Long, jagged teeth glinted as it bared them at me, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I raised my rifle, aiming for its head. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. It didn't move. Instead, it crouched, muscles tensing as if ready to pounce. I fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the stillness. The creature let out a howl, part pain, part fury, and lunged. I barely had time to fire again before it was on me. Its claws tore through my jacket, slicing into my flesh. The pain was blinding, but I kept fighting, jamming the barrel of the rifle against its chest and pulling the trigger. It howled again, a sound that made my ears ring, and then it was gone, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. I collapsed on the porch, blood pooling around me. The world spun, and the last thing I remember was the distant sound of footsteps, not the creatures, but human ones. When I woke, I was in a hospital. A hiker had found me the next morning, unconscious and barely alive. My wounds were severe but not fatal. The doctors said I was lucky. Lucky? That's not the word I'd use. The officials chalked it up to a bear attack, despite the lack of evidence. They didn't believe my story about the creature, dismissing it as trauma-induced hallucinations. But I know what I saw. The tracks, the mutilated animals, the eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. I left the ranger service after that. The forest no longer felt like a refuge. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that growl in my dreams. And every so often, I catch myself looking over my shoulder half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. They say the wilderness has a way of healing wounds, but for me, it was a place where nightmares came alive. It was 1981, and I had taken a seasonal job in Glacier National Park, Montana. I needed the solitude, the kind only the towering peaks and dense forests could offer. After losing my firefighting crew in a wildfire the year before, I'd been haunted by guilt and sleepless nights. The job seemed like a way to escape the noise in my head. The park was breathtaking, even in its quiet moments. Glacial lakes shimmered like polished glass, and the wind sang through the pine trees. My duties as a trail maintenance worker were simple enough: clearing fallen branches, checking paths for safety, and occasionally guiding lost hikers back to their campsites. I spent my days surrounded by nature, the only soundtrack being the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful, almost meditative. For a while, I thought maybe this place could help me find peace. It was during a solo overnight patrol that things started to feel off. My route took me through one of the less traveled trails near the park's northern edge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I set up camp by a small stream, the gurgling water lulling me into a rare moment of calm. As I sat by the fire, eating a can of beans, I heard it for the first time, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. It's easy to mistake natural sounds for something else when you're alone in the wild. But this was different. It was faint, almost like a voice, carried on the breeze. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the dark forest, but there was nothing, just the trees standing tall and silent. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found something strange. A few hundred yards from my campsite, an elk lay dead. Its neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its body was untouched by scavengers. What struck me most were the tracks around it, large, heavy imprints that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. They circled the elk, as if whatever made them had been toying with it before killing it. The unease from the night before returned, stronger this time. I snapped a few photos with my old camera and moved on, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached my next waypoint, the sun was setting again. I decided to make camp early, not wanting to navigate the trail in the dark. The whispers started up again as I prepared my fire, more distinct this time. They seemed to come from every direction, faint and fragmented, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. "Nathan!" I froze. My name, clear as day, whispered in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I grabbed my flashlight and spun around, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Just the crackling of my fire and the distant chirping of crickets. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the wind, an auditory hallucination born of fatigue, but deep down I knew better. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of something watching me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching leaves just beyond the edge of my campsite. I sat up, gripping the handle of my axe, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Nathan, come here." I didn't sleep at all after that. The following morning, I decided to cut my patrol short. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what. As I packed up, I noticed more of those strange tracks in the dirt around my campsite. They were closer this time, almost within the circle of my firelight. Whatever had been out there had been watching me. The day passed uneventfully, but the sense of dread lingered. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing with a panoramic view of the mountains. The beauty of the scene did little to calm my nerves. I decided to take a short break before making the final push back to the ranger station. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a shadow cast by the trees, but then it moved, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed a faint, sickly red, like embers smoldering in a dying fire. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I froze, my mind racing. Was it human? An animal? Something else entirely? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, in a voice that chilled me to my core, it spoke. "Help me." The voice was distorted, a horrible mimicry of a human's. It took a step forward, and I stumbled back, my axe slipping from my hand. The creature's movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The forest seemed to close in around me as I fled, the trees a blur of dark shapes. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally burst out onto the trail leading to the ranger station, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I reached the station just as the last light of day faded. My supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Tom, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him everything, expecting him to laugh it off or accuse me of making it up. Instead, his face grew pale. "You saw it," he said quietly. "The Wendigo." He wouldn't say much more, only that the park had its share of strange stories, and that it was best not to go looking for explanations. I left Glacier National Park at the end of the season and never went back. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, the product of stress and isolation, or maybe it was something else, something that defies explanation. All I know is that the whispers still haunt my dreams, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear them calling my name. I'll always remember how loud the swamp could get at night. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, and the occasional rustle of something moving in the reeds. It was a part of my daily life as a park ranger at Congaree National Park. But in the summer of 1985, something happened that changed how I felt about that place and the world around me. It started like any other day. I began my shift early, with the sun barely peeking through the trees. My job was pretty routine, checking water levels, clearing out debris, and keeping an eye out for poachers. The swamp had its own rhythm, and I'd learned how to go with it. The air was heavy and sticky, and my boots squelched in the damp ground as I walked the trails. By the afternoon, I was deep in the park, far from the regular hiking trails. I liked it out there, where the swamp felt wild and untouched. But something wasn't right that day. It started small. The usual sounds of animals and insects felt quieter, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, figuring the heat was just messing with me. Then I saw the tracks. They were huge impressions in the mud, much bigger than anything I'd ever seen before. They weren't bare tracks, and they definitely weren't human. The prints were round, with 3 big claw marks. My heart started pounding as I crouched down to get a better look. Whatever made these tracks was enormous. I pulled out my Polaroid camera and snapped a picture. When I tried to radio the station, the signal kept cutting out. All I managed to say was something about strange tracks before static took over. I decided to follow the tracks. They led further into the swamp, winding through thick brush and crossing shallow pools of water. As I walked, I noticed more signs: snapped branches, deep scratches on trees, and grass that had been trampled flat. It looked like something huge had barreled through the area. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't stop myself from going forward. That's when I found Jake. Jake was another ranger, a tough guy who loved bad jokes and even worse coffee, But the person lying in front of me didn't look like Jake anymore. His uniform was torn and bloody, his throat ripped open. His face was frozen in an expression of pure fear. The tracks I'd been following led right to him and then continued toward the water. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to throw up. I'd seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It wasn't a bear or an alligator. The injuries were too big and too precise. Whatever did this wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered. I grabbed my radio again and called for help. This time, I managed to get through. Backup was on the way, but it would take hours for them to reach this remote part of the park. The sun was setting and shadows stretched across the swamp. I didn't want to leave Jake's body, but staying felt dangerous. I marked the spot on my map and started heading back toward the ranger station. The whole time I felt like something was watching me. Night came quickly in the swamp. By the time I reached my cabin, it was pitch dark. I locked the door and checked all the windows, my hands shaking. The swamp's usual sounds had returned, but they didn't feel comforting anymore. Every chirp and rustle made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard it. A deep splash, followed by the sound of something huge moving through the water. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound got closer, along with low, rumbling grunts that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, my palms sweaty. I shined the light on the water, but at first, I didn't see anything. Then, two massive eyes appeared just above the surface, glowing yellow in the beam. They blinked slowly, watching me. The water rippled, and I saw a long, snake-like body just below the surface. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The creature made a low, growling sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest. I fumbled for the flare gun on my belt and shot it into the air. The red light lit up the swamp for a moment. In that flash of light, I saw it clearly. Its body was huge, covered in rough, scaly skin that glistened in the water. Its long neck rose up, and its head looked like something out of a dinosaur book, with sharp teeth that gleamed in the light. It was like a nightmare come to life. The Mbembe. I'd heard stories about this creature before, a legendary beast supposedly living in the swamps of Africa. But this was South Carolina. It couldn't be real, but it was. The creature lunged toward the cabin, its massive tail sending waves through the water. I fired another flare, this time aiming at its face. It roared, a deafening sound, and pulled back, but it didn't leave. It circled the cabin, its glowing eyes locked on me. That's when I realized it wasn't just an animal. It was smart. I grabbed the radio and screamed for help, but all I got was static. The creature's tail slammed into the cabin, shaking the walls. I could hear the wood creaking and splintering. Desperate, I grabbed a can of gasoline and a lighter from the supply shelf. If I was going down, I wasn't going without a fight. I poured the gasoline on the porch and lit it. Flames roared to life, lighting up the swamp in a flickering orange glow. The creature let out another roar and backed off, but it didn't leave. It stayed just outside the fire's reach, waiting. That's the last thing I remember. When I woke up, it was daylight. The cabin was in ruins, and my colleagues found me barely conscious. My jacket was torn, and I was covered in scratches and bruises. Jake's body was gone, and there were no tracks left behind. The swamp had swallowed every trace of what happened. The official report said it was a gator attack, but I know the truth. Something ancient and powerful is out there, something that doesn't belong in this world. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear its roar in the distance. I don't know where to begin, but maybe that's part of why this story feels so heavy. It doesn't have a clean start or an easy ending. It's been over 30 years, and I still can't walk through a forest without looking over my shoulder. My name is Edgar Forsyth, and in the summer of 1990, I worked as a ranger at Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. What I'm about to tell you, I've shared with only a handful of people. Most don't believe me, and I can't blame them. It was late August, just before the leaves began to turn. The The summer crowds had thinned, leaving the trails quiet and the forest almost eerily still. My job that evening was simple: survey one of the more popular hiking routes, make sure there were no stragglers, and lock up the trailhead. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the towering Douglas firs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the occasional chirp of a bird broke the silence. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels like a blanket after a long day. I had just reached a clearing when I heard Ita scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from a playful group of hikers or a startled animal. No, this was different. It was sharp, guttural, and full of raw terror. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing off the rocky terrain, making it impossible to tell where it had come from. My first thought was that someone was hurt. I radioed the station, but the static was heavy, and my message didn't seem to go through. Taking a deep breath, I gripped my flashlight and headed in the direction I thought the scream had come from. The light was fading quickly, and the forest seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into the woods. About 20 minutes in, I found something that made my stomach churn. Carved into the bark of several trees were strange symbols. They looked like a mix of runes and crude drawings, each one more unsettling than the last. They were too deliberate to be the work of a bored hiker and too intricate to be random marks left by animals. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. Kids playing a prank, maybe. That's what I wanted to believe. I decided to head back to the main trail, but as I turned, I felt watched. It's hard to describe, but the air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, so I quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the dirt path. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the oppressive silence. The next day, I couldn't shake the unease. I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination, but when a report came in about a missing hiker, my heart sank. A young man named Mark had been camping with friends and decided to go on a solo hike. He never returned. We organized a search party and headed out early that morning. The forest, usually vibrant and alive, felt different. The mist clung to the ground, thicker than usual, and the trees seemed darker, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. After hours of searching, we found Hemor, what was left of him. Mark's body was sprawled at the base of a massive oak tree, stripped of flesh in places, his face frozen in a look of pure, unadulterated terror. I've seen animal attacks before, but this was something else. There were no claw marks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if something had taken him apart with precision. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The ranger's station was quiet, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. As I stepped outside, I froze. There, at the edge of the tree line, were two glowing red eyes. They didn't blink, they didn't move, they just stared, unyielding and unrelenting. My breath caught in my throat, and I fumbled for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing. The eyes were gone, but the feeling remained. I wasn't alone. The following days were a blur. More symbols appeared on the trees, deeper into the forest. Strange noises echoed at night whispers, heavy breathing, and the sound of something large moving just out of sight. I reported everything to my supervisor, but he dismissed it as stress and overwork. "Take a few days off," he said. But I couldn't leave, not yet. Then, it happened. I was patrolling the northern trails when I heard it again, that scream. This time it was closer. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, flashlight trembling in my hand. The mist was thicker than ever, clinging to my skin and making it hard to see. That's when I saw it. Standing in the clearing was a massive, distorted figure. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched and twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the fog. And the smell, it was overwhelming, a rancid mix of decay and earth. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. The creature tilted its head, studying me, and let out a low, guttural growl. I don't know how, but I managed to turn and run. My legs felt like lead, the forest a blur around me as I stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks. The creature's footsteps thundered behind me, impossibly fast and heavy. I reached the edge of a cliff, the forest falling away into a steep drop. There was nowhere to go. I turned, gripping a large branch as a makeshift weapon, and faced it. The creature stepped into the light of my flashlight, its form even more horrifying up close. Its mouth twisted into what I can only describe as a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. In a final act of desperation, I swung the branch with all my strength. It connected with the creature's head, and for a moment, it staggered. I used the opportunity to push forward, driving the creature back toward the edge. With one final shove, it toppled over the cliff, disappearing into the darkness below. But I lost my footing in the process. I remember the sensation of falling, the wind rushing past me, and then, nothing. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. A search team had found me at the base of the cliff, barely alive. They never found the creature, but they found the symbols, the screams, and the stories. I tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed me. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear heavy breathing outside my window. And sometimes, just before dawn, I swear I see those red eyes staring at me from the shadows. It's still out there, waiting. The Ozarks were supposed to be my escape. After 2 tours in Vietnam, I craved nothing more than silence the kind that only the deep woods could offer. When I took the ranger position at Ozark National Forest in the spring of 1974, I felt like I'd finally found my place. The forest, with its rolling hills and thick, misty underbrush, was alive but peaceful. It didn't judge me. It didn't remind me of what I'd done or seen. It just let me be. My days were simple: morning patrols, trail maintenance, and the occasional visitor who got lost or too ambitious. Evenings were for myself, spent at the small cabin the ranger station provided. No phone, no TV, just me and the sounds of the forest crickets, owls, and the occasional rustle of something larger in the undergrowth. That day started like any other. The sun filtered through the trees as I walked my usual route, checking for downed branches and signs of poachers. Birds chirped, and the soft rush of a nearby stream filled the gaps in the soundscape. I remember thinking how perfect it all was. Even the air felt cleaner here, untainted. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I returned to the cabin. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. I made a quick dinner: canned beans and some bread, and settled on the porch with a cup of coffee. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. The growl came again, this time followed by a howl long and mournful. It sounded distant, maybe a mile off, and I told myself it was just a coyote. They're not uncommon in these parts, especially at dusk. But something about it unsettled me. The pitch was too deep, too wrong. Shaking it off, I went inside and locked the door. Habit, mostly. I'd never felt unsafe out here before. That night, I slept fitfully. Dreams of the jungle, of being hunted, mingled with the sound of that growl. When I woke, the forest was unnaturally quiet. My patrol the next morning took me to a section of the forest I'd only visited a handful of times. It was more remote, harder to navigate. The mist hung heavy, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. About an hour in, I found the first one. A deer, or what was left of it. Its body was torn open, ribs jutting out like jagged teeth. The ground around it was soaked with blood, and tufts of fur were scattered like leaves. But it wasn't the gore that got me. It was the look in its eyes. Even in death, they seemed wide with terror. As I continued, I found more. 2 rabbits, a raccoon, and another deer, all mutilated in the same way. Some were still alive, but barely, their breaths ragged and shallow. I put them out of their misery, my hands shaking with each shot. Something was wrong. This wasn't the work of a coyote or even a bear. The bites were too large, the wounds too savage. It felt deliberate, almost cruel. I radioed the station to report the findings, but reception was spotty out here. All I managed to get through was a garbled message about animal attacks before the static swallowed my words. Frustrated, I decided to head back to the cabin. Whatever was out here, I'd deal with it better in the daylight. That night, the growl returned, closer this time. It echoed through the trees, low and menacing. Then came the howl, piercing and drawn out. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness. The forest seemed alive, every shadow shifting, every sound amplified. The growl came again, and this time I caught a glimpse of movement, a large, hulking shape slipping between the trees. I've faced danger before. Men with guns, traps, the chaos of war. But this was different. It was primal, a fear that gripped me deep in my chest and refused to let go. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It felt like it was watching me, studying me. The next few days were a blur of tension and sleepless nights. I set up traps, hoping to catch whatever was killing the animals. I even ventured deeper into the forest, against my better judgment, looking for signs. That's when I found the tracks. Massive, clawed prints that sank deep into the soil. They looked canine, but were far too large, each one nearly the size of my head. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't normal. The final night, the growls turned into something elsey, deep, guttural snarling that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin. It was here. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside, the cold night air biting my skin. The forest was deathly silent, as if every creature knew to stay hidden. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a pair of glowing yellow eyes piercing through the darkness. As it stepped into the moonlight, I felt my breath catch. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in shaggy fur that matted with blood. Its face was twisted, part wolf, part nightmare. Long, jagged teeth glinted as it bared them at me, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I raised my rifle, aiming for its head. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. It didn't move. Instead, it crouched, muscles tensing as if ready to pounce. I fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the stillness. The creature let out a howl, part pain, part fury, and lunged. I barely had time to fire again before it was on me. Its claws tore through my jacket, slicing into my flesh. The pain was blinding, but I kept fighting, jamming the barrel of the rifle against its chest and pulling the trigger. It howled again, a sound that made my ears ring, and then it was gone, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. I collapsed on the porch, blood pooling around me. The world spun, and the last thing I remember was the distant sound of footsteps, not the creatures, but human ones. When I woke, I was in a hospital. A hiker had found me the next morning, unconscious and barely alive. My wounds were severe but not fatal. The doctors said I was lucky. Lucky? That's not the word I'd use. The officials chalked it up to a bear attack, despite the lack of evidence. They didn't believe my story about the creature, dismissing it as trauma-induced hallucinations. But I know what I saw. The tracks, the mutilated animals, the eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. I left the ranger service after that. The forest no longer felt like a refuge. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that growl in my dreams. And every so often, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. The Everglades has always been a place of mystery. Sprawling swamps, buzzing insects, and the constant hum of unseen creatures was as alive as it was deadly. I've been a park ranger here for over 15 years. My name is Carl Wilkes, and nothing about the Everglades could surprise me anymore. At least, that's what I thought. It was a warm evening in late October 1991. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the swamp. I was doing my usual rounds, patrolling the less traveled parts of the park. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of rotting vegetation clung to everything. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and I loved the solitude. The swamp had a rhythm to it. Frogs croaked, crickets chirped, and the occasional splash of water told you where the gators were lurking. That night, though, the swamp felt off. It's hard to explain, but it was like the place was holding its breath. The usual sounds of life were muted, replaced by an unnatural stillness. I told myself it was just the weather. A cold front was moving in, and sometimes that could mess with the wildlife. Still, a part of me felt uneasy as I navigated the narrow trails in my boat. About an hour into my patrol, I came across an old campsite. It wasn't uncommon to find abandoned gear out here. Tourists get scared or overwhelmed and leave in a hurry. But this one was different. The tent was shredded, not collapsed or weathered like you'd expect. Gear was scattered everywhere, as if someone had been in a desperate rush to leave. What caught my attention most, though, were the footprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of my boot and deep enough in the mud to suggest something heavy had passed through. But they weren't gator tracks or bear tracks. I'd know those anywhere. These prints had an odd shape, almost human, but with claws. I radioed it into the station. "Base, this is Ranger Wilkes. I've got an unusual find at Sector 5. Possible vandalism or illegal poaching. Over." Static crackled back at me before the reply came. "Copy that, Carl. Stay safe and report back if you find anything else. Over." I decided to investigate further. The tracks led into the swamp, veering off the main trail and disappearing into the dense vegetation. Against my better judgment, I followed them. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled roots and thick reeds. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the insects seemed to vanish. Then I heard a clicking sound. It was faint at first, like claws tapping against rock. It stopped as quickly as it started, leaving me frozen in place. My heart pounded as I scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing, just shadows dancing on the water. "Probably a raccoon," I muttered to myself, trying to shake the growing unease. But the clicking returned, louder this time, and closer. It was accompanied by a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. I raised my rifle, more out of instinct than anything else. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something moving in the distance, a hulking figure that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound authoritative. "This is a restricted area. You need to leave." No response, just the oppressive silence of the swamp. I pressed on, my curiosity outweighing my fear. The tracks grew fresher, and the ground beneath them was churned up, as if whatever made them had been in a hurry. Then I found it, a canoe, half submerged in the water. Its sides were clawed up, the wood splintered and shredded. Inside were a backpack, some fishing gear, and a camera. The sight made my stomach turn. Whoever had been out here clearly didn't leave on their own terms. As I reached for the backpack, a deafening roar echoed through the swamp. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was guttural, primal, and it shook me to my core. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur that glistened in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the darkness like twin lanterns. Long claws extended from its hands, and its face, it was almost human but distorted, like something out of a nightmare. For a moment, neither of us moved. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. Then it lunged. I fired my rifle, the shot echoing through the swamp. The creature staggered but didn't fall. It let out another roar, this one filled with rage, and swiped at me with its claws. I felt a searing pain as they tore through my arm, sending me sprawling into the mud. Scrambling to my feet, I fired again, aiming for its chest. The bullet struck, and the creature let out a howl that made my blood run cold. But it didn't stop. It charged at me, knocking me to the ground and pinning me with its immense weight. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own screams and the creature's breath, hot and rancid against my face. Then darkness. When I woke up, it was daylight. I was lying half submerged in the water, my rifle broken in two beside me. My arm was torn up, the flesh ragged and bleeding, but I was alive. Barely. Rangers found me later that day after I failed to check in. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a gator attack, maybe a bear. But I know what I saw. They found the campsite and the canoe, but there was no sign of the creature, just those massive footprints leading deeper into the swamp. Locals started calling it the skunk ape, a legend brought to life. They say you can still hear its roar at night if you're brave enough to venture out there. As for me, I quit the job a week later. The swamp had taken something from me, something I'll never get back. And though I've tried to move on, I can still hear the clicking of claws in my nightmares. I've spent most of my life in Yosemite National Park, a place where the air feels ancient, the trees stand sentinel-like, and the granite cliffs hold stories older than humanity. My name is Michael Shaw, and I've been a park ranger here for over 2 decades. If anyone told me I'd one day leave this job more haunted than any ghost story I'd ever heard, I'd have laughed it off. But some things, no matter how much you want to forgetting to you, like the smell of smoke after a fire. In 1999, I returned to the park after a long leave of absence. My wife, Anna, had passed away unexpectedly, and the grief had gutted me. Yosemite was my refuge, my escape. I thought the vastness of the land and its indifferent beauty might help me find some semblance of peace. I was wrong. It was late October when the incident happened. The air had turned crisp, and the park was quieter than usual. Most of the summer tourists had gone, leaving behind only a few hardcore hikers and climbers. I was stationed near Yosemite Valley, tasked with routine patrols and the occasional rescue operation. My shift that evening was uneventful. Checking trails, ensuring campsites were clean, and reminding the few visitors to store their food properly to avoid attracting bears. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the valley. I parked my truck at one of the trailheads and decided to take a short walk to clear my head. The sounds of the park at dusk, rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl were oddly comforting. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt too still, like it was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was another hiker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. No response. The steps continued, steady and deliberate, but they didn't sound quite right. They were too heavy, almost like someone dragging something behind them. I scanned the area with my flashlight but saw nothing. "Probably an animal," I muttered, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. Still, I decided to head back to my truck. As I walked, the footsteps seemed to follow me, always staying just out of sight. Back at the truck, I radioed the station to report the odd noise, but no one seemed concerned. "Could be a black bear," one of my colleagues suggested. "Just keep an eye out." The next day, I returned to the same area to check for signs of wildlife. What I found was disturbing. Near the trail, there were footprints, but not the kind you'd expect. They were massive, easily twice the size of my boot, and the shape was strange. They looked almost human, but with elongated toes and deep claw marks at the tips. Nearby, I noticed claw marks gouged into the bark of a tree, the wood still fresh and oozing sap. Broken branches littered the ground, leading into a narrow gorge that wasn't on any of our maps. I reported the findings to my supervisor, but he brushed it off. "Probably just some pranksters trying to stir up a Bigfoot story," he said with a chuckle. "Don't let it get to you, Mike." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the strange footprints and the eerie stillness of the forest. Around midnight, I decided to drive back to the gorge. Something about it gnawed at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The drive was uneventful, the road illuminated only by my headlights. When I arrived at the trailhead, the air felt colder than it should have been, and the forest was deathly silent. I grabbed my flashlight and started down the trail, the beam cutting through the darkness. As I neared the gorge, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting grotesque shadows in the moonlight, and then I saw it. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, stood a figure. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a hulking frame. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, reflecting the light like a predator's. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Slowly, I raised my flashlight higher, trying to get a better look. The beam illuminated patches of coarse, matted hair and a face that was almost human but disturbingly wrong. Its features were twisted, its mouth too wide, and its teeth sharp and jagged. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath me. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and I turned and ran as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. Somehow, I made it back to my truck and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The creature didn't follow me out of the forest. When I finally mustered the courage to look back, the edge of the woods was empty. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an oppressive weight that stayed with me all the way back to the station. I reported the encounter, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to stress and grief over Anna's death. I even started to doubt myself, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the footprints, the claw marks, and the broken branches were real. I know what I saw. A week later, a hiker went missing near the same gorge. His body was never found, only his torn backpack and a trail of those same massive footprints leading deeper into the forest. I left Yosemite a few months after that. The park had always been my sanctuary, but now it felt tainted, like something ancient and malevolent had claimed it. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps.